good morning, everyone, or I should say good afternoon to some of you. It all depends on where you are. You may be interested to know that we have NACD members from across the country and their guests joining us today. We do hope you're all healthy and safe. And I just have to say, it's so good to be back with you today. I always find it a pleasure to spend time with people who care about enriching their knowledge. So thank you all for taking time to do this with us. Now, before we begin our program today, I really want to take a moment to recognize Kathy Walker. She served in a leadership role with the NACD Heartland chapter, the board. She shared her knowledge by being a speaker at NACD events, and now she's a member of the Heartland Programming Committee. And it's because of her great insights and efforts that we're able to present this program to you today. I also want to recognize Julie Burkhardt. You just heard her. She's our executive director. And many of you have seen her name or interacted with her. We really want to thank her for doing such a good job of pulling this event together. We're looking forward to having a great event, and that's also going to be due to the speakers on the program. We owe a huge thank you to Vicki Westerhouse for moderating today's session. Vicki's an active NACD member and a partner at the law firm of Bryan Cave Leighton Paisner, and they're sponsoring today's event. Joining Vicki will be Terry Vaughn, a seasoned board leader and an NACD Heartland chapter ambassador, Lori Stone, an SEC enforcement attorney, and Terry Pritchard, an experienced securities litigator. What a powerhouse group we have today. I'm confident you'll be able to learn from their expertise. We all will be. And I'll now turn it over to Vicki Westerhouse.
Thank you, Sandra. We are honored to sponsor this webinar for you today. So we all know that boards are tasked with overseeing companies and management, but sometimes it seems like they may turn a blind eye. For example, when Boeing 737 airliners crashed, the board was accused of being slow to respond. There was a story in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend about an investor suit filed earlier this month by New York and Colorado public pension funds. And those funds alleged that the directors overlooked safety matters, even though many of the board members had extensive experience in aviation and related industries. In fact, in earlier investigations, anonymous statements to the Wall Street Post, some of these former Boeing board members said that, quote, safety was just a given, and that, quote, the board doesn't have any tools to oversee safety. So, Terry Vaughn, what types of regular reporting tools should the board receive to adequately perform its oversight functions?
Well, first, let me say that's just a shocking statement that it's important that the board have some kind of oversight of the compliance function. And the compliance, the challenge is that compliance is such a broad area and touches so many aspects of the firm that you really need to be diligent and kind of systematic about the way that you approach it. Having standard work plans that are touching on the kinds of reports that you need in your committees. And a lot of that, as I said, is going to be firm specific. But for example, obvious candidates are make sure you're looking at the internal audit reports and what that might be telling you about issues related to compliance. Get regular reports from the compliance function. You can look at things like trends in consumer complaints, whistleblower reports, FCPA and AML violations. Are there new requirements for accounting rules and so forth? One of the boards that I'm on, the health insurance company, there's so much compliance in the health insurance area that we actually created a separate committee, compliance committee, and we dig into the compliance.
Getting an echo.
From where? We dig into the compliance program and we get regular reports on potential compliance issues. And we can look then, the DOJ has guidelines on what an effective compliance program looks like. So you can stack your program up against the DOJ's guidelines. So I think that's something to think about. The other thing, a couple of other areas that I like to pay attention to, the relationship with the regulators, of course. What kinds of meetings is management? If there are any significant meetings, if you've gotten inquiries, you should hear about those. Recent exams, regulators will come in and do exams, and what are you learning from that? And significant regulatory filings. And then third area I'd say is looking more broadly across the market to what is happening with other companies, particularly other companies in your industry. In the insurance sector, for example, loss reserving, how loss reserves are estimated and reported. There's a lot of judgment in that, and that can be an area of focus. So what is the SEC focused on? What are other companies getting into trouble from? And you can get a lot of this. I found the independent auditors to be a very, very helpful resource for understanding the trends in the marketplace. And then for internationally active companies, of course, you have the whole issue about making sure that you're staying on top of what's happening internationally. What's the relationship with the regulators? How are you tracking regulatory developments? Besides reporting on all of this, though, Vicki, one of the things that I really like to pay attention to is the attitude of the company toward regulation, toward compliance, the culture of the company. When they talk about compliance, do they talk about it as something that they just have to do because the regulators are making them? Or do they see the broader purpose? Are they the good citizen, or are they just trying to comply with the letter of the, are they complying with the spirit and not just the letter of the law? And that you really have to, like so many things with culture, you have to listen, you have to read between the lines, you have to look for the subtle kind of indications. But if you get the culture right, if the company cares about compliance and regulation, right, if they really care about it, then the chances that you're going to have problems down the road are much reduced.
Great advice, Terry. Terry Pritchard, do you have additional thoughts?
Well, that was a great summary. I guess what I would say, looking at the big picture, is the board ought to be receiving regular reports on anything that it or management reasonably anticipates can create material exposure for the firm. So when I was the chair of Brian Cave, I put in place a formal process where we would hear periodically from the people who ran areas of potential risk. So translating that to the public company setting, this one was applicable to a law firm too, we'd hear annually or semi-annually from the head of IT, who would talk to us about what processes we had in place and what systems we had to keep confidential information secure. Obviously, we've all read about the McDonald's CEO. I think it's important for companies to think about hearing from the head of HR. Are there any discrimination issues of concern, Me Too issues of concern? You talked about Boeing and safety issues in aerospace, in automotive, probably in pharmaceutical. Boards ought to be hearing regularly from the head of safety about some of the safety issues. So I do think you refer to it as regular reporting, and I would say it's regular reporting, but it needs to be alive too, and boards and management need to be sensitive to current risk issues and make sure the board's being informed about those.
Great points. So in our earlier Boeing example, the plaintiffs in some of the lawsuits alleged that directors ignored red flags and were careless in their oversight of the flawed 737 MAX 8 airliners. In fact, they were accused of failing to respond promptly after crashes killed more than 300 people. In the article this weekend, one of the allegations was that it took nearly a month for the board to hold a meeting after the first crash, which occurred in October of 2018. And that meeting was optional by conference call because of the impending Thanksgiving holiday. Lori, what red flags should directors notice that could lead to an SEC investigation?
Sure. So Vicki, I think I'll respond kind of in a two-part response. First, I'll focus a little bit on the case law and the legal precedent and what has been identified as red flags by courts. And then I'll draw on my experience as an enforcement attorney and talk about some common areas I've seen that are prone to manipulation. So starting with the case law, and I will caution that, this is a canvassing of jurisdictions across the country. So, to the extent that audience members want to know about the law in a specific jurisdiction, you should definitely look to that. But generally across the country, one area that has been identified as a potential red flag are tips or conversations alleging fraud that come to board members' attention. So, someone at the company comes to the board and makes a confidential statement, or maybe the company has a hotline for people to report things. I know I've seen this in the FCPA context, or there's some other sort of scenario, maybe an internal audit, an internal auditor who comes to the board and shares a concern. So that has been identified as courts as one type of red flag. Another type of red flag is a domineering CEO. And this is a term of art that is used by auditors, to identify when a CEO essentially has unchecked power. And one scenario I've seen in my work is you have a CEO who is really heading up an internal investigation, and that can lead to all kinds of problems. So a domineering CEO is another red flag. A third red flag involves auditors, auditor resignations. And I had another case involving an auditor resignation. So if the company's auditor is resigning, as a board member, you should really try to understand why. What is going on here? What's resulting in the resignation? Was there a disagreement with management? Was the auditor trying to get access to some documentation and the company just wasn't providing it? What's going on that's causing the auditor to resign? And ideally in this situation, you want to be talking directly to the auditor and not having someone at the company serving as a middleman or middlewoman. Related to auditors also, if an auditor is taking a contrary position, sometimes this has been identified as a red flag. And I think as a board member, you just want to understand, what the company's position is and really get comfort with the position the company is taking. Some more obvious examples of red flags are management shakeups. So when you have a CEO, a CFO who is abruptly terminated or abruptly resigns, that could be a red flag. Government investigations and indictments, another red flag. And financial restatements. Obviously there's a broad range of reasons that companies may restate, but some courts have identified this as a potential red flag. So just as a board member, you should really understand why the restatement is happening, why the CEO is resigning, why there's a government investigation. You want to try to get to the bottom of those issues. And then just to highlight some common areas that I've seen that can be subject to manipulation. And Terry mentioned this a little bit, just focusing on areas that involve significant judgments and estimates, and particularly in times when there are economic downturns, which I think we're seeing and will continue to see in this environment today. Areas that are subject to judgment and estimates can be subject to manipulation as well. And just by way of example, some of these areas would include fair value and impairment considerations, ALLL considerations, so loan and lease losses, debt modifications or restructurings, revenue recognition, adoption of new accounting standards, and the like. And I'll make one note that our former co-director of enforcement, Stephen Pekin, he recently said publicly that, and I'll quote, "In the COVID-19 context, the Commission is specifically focusing on disclosures, impairments, or evaluations that may attempt to disguise previously undisclosed problems or weaknesses as coronavirus related." So, I think currently and in the near future, the SEC will really be taking a magnifying glass to disclosures regarding some of these judgment areas.
Wow, thank you, Lori. So let's dive a little bit deeper on these types of issues. Former SEC Commissioner Mary Jo White once said that being a director, quote, "is not for the uninitiated or faint of heart." And I think we can definitely see why as we talk with Lori about the different things that the SEC is looking at. But Lori, let's talk a little bit about how individual directors could end up in the SEC's enforcement crosshairs.
Sure. So over the course of the past 20 years, the Commission has initiated a limited number of fraud actions against board members. And I'll note that my answer here is focused on Commission actions, so not necessarily investor suits. And from my review of the case law, Commission cases, I think there are really two categories of cases, right, where board members end up in SEC crosshairs. The first is the category of case where a director is not only knowledgeable about the fraud, but is actually perpetuating it, actively involved in the fraud, or is actively involved in covering it up. So I think an example of this is the Nissan case that we brought in September of last year. I think this is our most recent case against a board member. And in this case, the CEO and the director engaged in a scheme to conceal approximately $90 million of CEO compensation from public disclosure, and also issued misleading disclosures concerning the CEO's pension allowance. Kelly, the director, was charged with aiding and abetting violations of Section 10B of the Exchange Act, or fraud provisions. And Nissan was ordered to pay a $15 million penalty, and Kelly agreed to a $100,000 penalty and some bars, a 5-year officer and director bar, and a 5-year bar from appearing before the Commission as an attorney, because he was an attorney. So that's an example of a case where, a board member is actively involved in the fraud or the cover-up. The second category of cases, and I think these are the minority of cases, are where a director was privy to a red flag that should have caused him or her to take action, but he or she did not, and they nonetheless signed the financial disclosures or made some other public statement as to the financial health of the company. And I wanted to highlight a couple of cases in this area. They're older, but I think the facts might be interesting to this group. The first is SEC versus Ravel. And this is a 2010 case in which the Commission filed charges against several individuals associated with Omaha-based Info USA, Inc., including a complaint against former outside director and audit committee chairman, Vasant H. Ravel. And the Commission alleged that Ravel failed to respond appropriately to various red flags concerning the CEO's expenses and the company's related party transactions with entities that were owned by the CEO. The Commission also alleged that Ravel failed to take appropriate action when concerns were expressed to him by internal auditors that the CEO was submitting expenses for personal items. And finally, Ravel failed to take meaningful action to further investigate the CEO's misconduct and omitted critical facts when reporting out to the rest of the board. So Ravel consented to the entry of judgment against him and was fined $50,000 and also took a 5-year O&D bar. Another case is SEC versus Berman. And in this case, the SEC brought settled civil action against John Berman, who was the director and chairman of First American Health Concepts, Inc. And the complaint alleges that Berman was advised by outside auditors. So here you have outside auditors bringing the tip or the red flag, and the CFO of a problem with the reporting of accounts receivables and reconciliation to the general ledger. Berman disregarded these concerns and, rather than address the problem, actually directed the CEO to focus on another unrelated project. Berman thereafter signed the disclosures filed with the Commission, knowing that this issue was outstanding. So I think in this second category of cases involving red flags, it's really going to be fact-driven. You're going to want to look to the facts of this case. It is a recklessness standard. Some jurisdictions apply an extreme recklessness standard. Some just use regular recklessness. But in either case, it has to be an extreme departure from the ordinary standard of care, which is actually a pretty high burden for the government to meet, which I think is why we don't see a lot of cases in this second category. And before moving on from this question, I think I will note for this group that on the other hand, courts have found that, and I think you can avoid being tangled up in SEC crosshairs, courts have found that when a director exercises a good faith effort to be informed and exercises appropriate judgment, the director satisfies his or her duty of attention.
Great food for thought, Lori. Thank you. So let's turn to another case making headlines. Eastman Kodak continues to suffer extensive and unwanted press, as well as a proposed class action. You guys have probably seen the press reports on this, but Kodak inadvertently publicly disclosed a possible significant loan transaction with the government to bring pharmaceutical production back to the U.S. Unfortunately, the loan, it was in the very early stages, and this press led to scrutiny on timing of possible insider trading issues, making stock gifts and option grants after the stock skyrocketed after this news was inadvertently announced. The board special committee retained Aiken Gump to conduct an investigation, which is discussed actually in an article that we'll be distributing after today's webinar. Aiken Gump concluded that there was no wrongdoing, but it remains to be seen yet whether the SEC and other investors agree with that and with the scope of the investigation. So, Terry Pritchard, when should the board decide to conduct its own investigation on a matter?
So thanks, Vicki. I would say the board should, as in take over completely running an investigation. They should do that when the issues involved are material and when management is potentially implicated. And that's a pretty broad concept, when management is potentially implicated, because most financial results, for example, have the possibility of implicating management. Any unethical behavior that is of concern implicates management. So, you know, if it's a serious matter, the board does need to give some thought to that. The other category that comes up is sometimes the board learns about a potential problem because they learn that the SEC is investigating. And there are times when I think boards should offer to the SEC to retain counsel and conduct the investigation and report back to the SEC. For example, in the FCPA context, it's very difficult for the government to get complete records because many of them can be overseas. The board has more access to those records in a subsidiary, and the board has the oversight responsibility, so it also wants to know what was going on. I was once, following up on Lori's, some of Lori's examples, I was once retained by a compensation committee because they learned of an SEC investigation into the CEO's compensation and perks, and we offered to do the investigation and report back, and reported back that indeed there was misuse of the company airplane, and some family members and girlfriends had credit cards from the company and various other things. So it is an effective way to protect the company in an instance like that and show that the company's doing the right thing.
Hey, Terry Vaughn, what are your thoughts?
Well, I don't think I have much to offer beyond that, Vicki. That was a really terrific answer, Terry. It really goes to whether you're confident that management can address the issue without bias. And then, of course, how material is it? In my experience, a lot of the regulatory issues that will come up are things that management's perfectly capable of addressing. And so it really goes to when there is not that confidence in management. And I think that's an unusual situation, although the Eastman Kodak example you gave is a perfect example of where the board needed to be involved.
So let's drill down a little bit more in this area. So in addition to the Kodak investigation, Terry Pritchard mentioned the McDonald's CEO situation. So you've probably seen the headlines on this, but the board is now suing the former CEO to recover a $40 million plus severance that was paid to the CEO after he admitted a consensual relationship with an employee. That was last year. Then over the summer, the board received hotline tips about possible relationships the CEO had with other employees. And at that point, the board did a more complete investigation and discovered text messages and communications and photos that showed that the CEO had relationships with a number of other employees, despite statements to the contrary. So, Terry Vaughn, what key factors should the board consider to determine the scope of an internal investigation?
Well, Again, this is a fact specific. This is going to depend on the case, but the investigation should go as far as necessary for the board to be comfortable that they're not missing something. And so I can give you some examples. If there are sales practice issues and you find them in one office, then you have to start looking in the other offices and see, is this going on in other places? If there are financial reporting issues, who was involved? What was the process for making that decision? So I think it's about gaining confidence, and you need to understand the operations of the company and where the tentacles of this particular problem spread within the company, and then go in there and dig in. I tend to lean personally toward a broader investigation. That's my bias, and it may be from my regulatory background, but again, it depends on the issue. It depends on the level of materiality, and it depends on what the problem might suggest about the culture of the company. Back to culture again, that may may make you lean towards something even broader.
Terry Pritchard, do you have additional insights on this issue?
All I would add is it's hard to understand how the investigators into the McDonald's CEO could have missed what they missed. That's not that broad an investigation. It's one person and one person's emails and one person's text. I agree totally with everything you said, Terry. My bias may be to start more narrowly in the circumstances where it's not clear whether or how big the problem is. But I also agree that if you discover a problem, you need to follow the tentacles and see where they lead. That doesn't mean in an FCPA investigation, you necessarily need to see if there were bribes in every location where the company is operating, for example. So I think reasonable lines can be drawn. The other thing is if Lori and her colleagues are involved and you are reporting to them that you're doing this investigation, I can assure you I've never known them to say, oh, you don't have to go that far. They will always push you to look more broadly, and sometimes it does require a bit of negotiation and an explanation of why you've drawn the lines where you are. But at the end of the day, back to what Terry said, you've got to follow the information you gather and to the end and make sure you've covered everything.
Thank you, Terry. In recent years, the SEC has encouraged companies to self-report violations in exchange for reduced fines or penalties. And this first started in 2001 with the Seaboard report, and then later in the cooperation program that became effective in 2011, and which was, by the way, amended last week to accelerate payments to cooperating parties, among other things. Lori, let's start with you. So what are the benefits and downsides of self-reporting internal investigation results to the SEC?
So thank you, Vicki. So self-reporting is viewed by the Commission as a form of cooperation. And as you might imagine, I am a big proponent of cooperation. That's always the preferable posture of any company that we're engaging with. But having been part of the defense bar for about a decade, I do understand why cooperation can sometimes be a hard pill to swallow. The SEC has a robust cooperation program, and it's intended to promote cooperation in our investigations, and it provides incentives for companies and individuals to do so. And, we use a framework to evaluate whether, how much, and in what manner to credit cooperation with individuals and entities. And as you mentioned, Vicki, the Seaboard report is kind of the holy grail of our cooperation documents. It was published in 2001, and we still refer to it constantly. It sets out a number of questions that we consider. Just to give you some flavor of what types of questions are included, it asks, how was the misconduct detected and who uncovered it? How long after the discovery of the misconduct did it take to implement an effective response? So going to your Boeing example. What steps did the company take upon learning of the misconduct? Again, going to your Boeing example, where there was a lag there and there was an involuntary meeting. So I guess that's one way that we determine how much and in what way to credit cooperation. Another way, we've issued various commission policy statements throughout the years. You know, we understand and we are constantly receiving feedback from the defense bar and from companies that we want to know more. We want you to be more transparent about how you award cooperation, how you reward us coming in self-reporting as to the results of an internal investigation. So those are some of the documents that the SEC has issued that you can look to. I personally think that one of the best ways to get insight into the cooperation program and the benefits of self-reporting is by looking at some of the cases that we've recently brought where cooperation is credited. And so I'll just highlight a couple of those cases for you. One of them is called Hain Celestial. It was brought in December of 2018 by one of my colleagues in my small group that I work with. And in this case, Hain Celestial, who is the maker of tea, it was basically a channel stuffing case. So Hain was encouraging two of its largest distributors with incentives at the end of fiscal quarters to encourage the purchase of sufficient inventory for Hain to meet its quarterly internal sales targets. So we did not end up imposing any penalty in this case. Zero penalty was imposed. And if you look at the complaint, it gives a lot of details as to why. And one of the first things mentioned is that Hain promptly self-reported. So Hain came to the commission, described what happened, and assisted with the commission's investigation, including by providing regular updates and analysis related to its internal investigation. Some other things listed by the commission in the complaint is that Hain undertook many remedial measures. In particular, it made a number of organizational changes, such as hiring staff in compliance positions and establishing an internal audit function, which it hadn't had previously, which may have contributed to the problem. Hain also implemented changes to its revenue recognition practices, which was the area of accounting at issue in the case, such as revisions to its revenue recognition policies and procedures, revisions to its review process and monitoring controls over contracts with customers, over customer payments and incentives. And Hain also developed a revenue recognition and contract review training program. So all of this is cited as rationale for why the commission declined to impose a penalty. One more case that was brought just last year where we declined to impose a penalty was PPG Industries, Inc. In this case, we found that PPG failed to properly record various expense accruals and misclassified certain income, which resulted in PPG inflating its income in its financial statements for about 2 years. In the complaint, the commission says it imposed no penalty against PPG in recognition of its prompt self-reporting. Once again, there's a pattern here. Extensive cooperation and implementation of remedial measures immediately upon learning of the improper conduct for which it was charged. Before I move on, I do feel like I need to talk a little bit about the whistleblower program in the context of self-reporting. As you probably know, the SEC has a pretty robust whistleblower program that was also enacted in the wake of Dodd-Frank. And the commission is authorized by Congress to provide monetary awards to individuals who come forward with high quality original information that assists us with our investigations. And in order to get an award, the amount of sanctions that the commission orders must exceed $1 million. And then the individual whistleblower or whistleblowers will get a percentage of that award not to exceed 30%. I've actually had a couple of whistleblower cases, and I'll tell you, whistleblower firms are cropping up across the country, and they're really able to put together some dynamite information that really assists us in our investigation. And for the two cases that I currently have involving whistleblowers, I have to say, like, I don't know how the SEC would have had visibility into these issues, but for the whistleblower. And I think this morning something popped up on my computer about we issued a $30 million award to 2 individuals. This was about an hour ago. And just this year alone, the commission has made 25 awards totaling 133 million. So that was before the 30, so I guess now it's 163 million. And that actually represents a more than 100% increase in the number of awards issued in a single year as compared to the next highest year. So there is significant financial incentive for these whistleblowers. And this can probably can see where I'm going with all this talk about whistleblowers in this context. You know, if your company is conducting an internal investigation and the results of that investigation do show that there was some sort of wrongdoing, and you decide not to self-report, you know, there's a real chance that someone in the room or someone who's privy to the information at the company will report it to the SEC. And I think also, you know, even in the event that there is not clear wrongdoing as a result of the internal investigation, if there's something that pushes the envelope or falls into a gray area, you know, it still could be the case that it could get reported. And I tell you this just so, you know, you keep it in the back of your mind when you're considering whether or not to self-report.
Thank you, Lori. Yeah, we've seen some record-breaking whistleblower payouts, so pretty strong incentives out there for people to be aware of. So Terry Pritchard, I suspect you may have a slightly different view on the idea of self-reporting, so we'd like to hear your thoughts.
Not across the board. There's an awful lot of that I do agree with, actually. I mean, I always feel a little bit like a cowboy, so let me start by saying boards always have to do the right thing. And if there are concerns about possible wrongdoing, they do have to investigate. They do have to fix the problem. They do have to deal with the employees who caused the problem, change policies and procedures, and take any other remedial action that should be taken. And that's a given. The board has to do the right thing. And I do agree that self-reporting, in order to get what I will call purported cooperation credit, is important in a case where, or is worthwhile in a case where whatever you discovered is material and needs to be disclosed anyway, or where there are whistleblowers who are likely to report it to the government anyway. In other words, the standard is the government going to find out anyway because we have to disclose it or somebody's going to tell them, in which case we might as well go in first and get the credit that we potentially can get. And I do also agree with Lori that the whistleblower piece of this has increased exponentially over the last few years. There are more whistleblowers than ever, and it is not unreasonable to think that whistleblowers will emerge. All of that said, if the investigation does not reveal wrongdoing for sure, and if you don't think there are whistleblowers who will report whatever you were looking at to the government, I do think you should stop and think about whether or not to self-report. First of all, if it's in a gray area and it's not clear that there was a violation and you report it to the government, I can assure you they won't just take your word for it. They will do another investigation that will cost you millions of dollars and will divert management time, and they may or may not agree with the conclusions that you reached. You know, the other thing that I would say is if you go to them with wrongdoing, they're not going to say, you did the right thing by coming to us. This time we're going to take a pass, go forth and sin no more, or we won't have the same reaction next time. What they're going to say is, with the possible exception of the two examples Lori gave us, where they imposed no penalty, their more typical reaction is, thank you for this information. You need to settle a case in which we will allege fraud, and here's a big fine. But don't worry, the fine would have been bigger had you not come to us. And we will say to the world that you cooperated in our investigation. So it's not for me a given if it's in the gray area that you really should go into the government and report.
Terry Vaughn, what are your views on this issue?
This is a tough one. I would say when it comes to dealing with the SEC, I'd go get somebody like Terry to come in and give us some advice. That's what I would.
Music to my ears.
It does go to how material is it and how likely is it that they're going to find out about it anyway. But having said that, I mean, there's two other things I want to say. One is I tend to lean, and this probably goes back to my regulatory background, I tend to lean more toward cooperation. But I also recognize, and this is the second part of this, that regulators are different and they react to things differently. So the SEC, it might be a different answer for the SEC than for your banking regulator or your insurance regulator, who they're going to come in, they're going to be doing regular exams, they're going to find it anyway, they're going to be reading the internal audit reports, and you better be transparent with those regulators. And so that's why I think it's really good when you have a significant regulatory issue to get someone who understands those regulators and how they think and process that, because it's really not the same. The regulators do not think the same and behave the same way.
Very true. Thank you, Terry. Let's change gears and explore an SEC-driven investigation scenario. Terry Pritchard, outside the self-reporting scenario, how should the board be involved in an SEC investigation and in what capacity?
Well, what I would say is it depends. I think every answer we've had on this panel is it depends. It depends on who's involved and what the allegations are. But I would say, as a general rule, that SEC investigations are material enough that at a minimum, the board should be receiving regular reports from the general counsel and outside counsel together on what's happening and how it's progressing. The board should communicate its perspective that cooperation, not in the credit category, get cooperation credit by reporting, but cooperating in an investigation, making sure all of the documents that are responsive are delivered timely, making sure that the employees are making themselves available, and making sure there are no intermediate steps that need to be taken to address whatever the concerns of the SEC are so that you don't end up with repeat violations.
Okay, thank you. Lori, earlier this week, the SEC issued a press release about investigations generated through its EPS initiative, which is a risk-based data analytic that's being used by the SEC. Would you please tell us more about that, as well as other current key trends and developments in SEC enforcement cases?
Sure. So I feel like I should probably start with the impact of coronavirus, because that has had a pretty big impact on our program. And since mid-March, the staff has triaged more than 13,000 tips, complaints, and referrals, TCRs, which is a 64% increase over the same period last year. And this year with COVID, we're seeing a new crop of cases. The Division of Enforcement has created a coronavirus steering committee, which basically coordinates the division's response to these cases and also allocates resources. Since February, we have suspended trading in securities.
Oh. Let's all mute. I'm not sure where the echo is coming from, but everybody but Lori, please mute.
So we have suspended trading in securities of more than 30 issuers as a result of questions about the adequacy and the accuracy of coronavirus-related information. And just to give you some examples, some of these suspensions have been related to claims about access to testing materials, developments of treatments or vaccines, access to PPE, companies making claims that they had this access or these treatments in development when in fact they did not. The Commission has also suspended trading in the stock of at least 3 microcap issuers whose names or ticker symbols closely resemble those of unrelated companies whose products are actually relevant to COVID-19. So such as testing, the N95 masks, or video conferencing technology. And this is due to concerns about investor confusion. And I have to note that one such microcap company had Zoom in its name. So the company's stock soared, but alas, it was not the Zoom that we are using right now. So as we move forward, I think it will be interesting to see what accounting issues and questions arise, including what the auditors may see. And there are a number of issues on companies' balance sheets that I think we'll be focused on. A lot of these judgment areas that we've talked about already, such as impairments, leases, also tax liabilities. And these areas may not have been affected in the past, but I think, certainly lots of companies will be affected by these areas in the future. Every year, the Division of Enforcement does put out a report, an annual report, and I will refer you to the 2019 report to kind of see what's highlighted as trends, and there's all kinds of data metrics that are organized in different ways. So how many original cases we've brought, how many follow-on cases, how many cases against individuals, et cetera, et cetera. This report is very helpful. We'll be putting out one in a few months for fiscal year 2020. But I did think for this group, it would be worthwhile to highlight some of the work that we've done on financial fraud. This area is very important to our program, and we've really put a lot of focus on it in recent years. So financial fraud is kind of a large umbrella under which various types of fraud are included. One such type are fraudulent accounting practices intended to misrepresent a company's underlying financial condition. And some examples of these cases include the Commission's action against Theranos, which was brought in 2018, and Hertz, which was brought just last year. Another area, intentionally distorted non-GAAP metrics and key performance indicators. And we had the case against Wells Fargo and Valiant. Those were both current this year. Last year, we had the case against Fiat Chrysler. And in 2018, we had the case against Walgreens that all fall into this category. Misrepresentations or omissions in connection with risk factors. So we had the Facebook case last year, for which we imposed a $100 million penalty. And we also had the Mylon case, which involved EpiPen. We also have materially misleading and incomplete disclosures. So we already talked about the Nissan case, which would fall in this category, which involved the charges against the board member. Also, we had the Volkswagen case in 2019. And then earlier this week, we settled a case with Fiat Chrysler. In this case, the case related to misleading disclosures about the result of an internal audit. So that might be a case that's interesting to this group. So I will refer you to the complaint. And in that case, Fiat Chrysler agreed to pay a $9.5 million penalty, so quite sizable. And one final category, failures by auditors to uphold their duties as gatekeepers. And we had the case, which was pretty incredible, against the KPMG last year for improperly obtaining information about PCAOB inspections and sharing it with their clients. Thank you. I'll hand it back to Vicki.
Thank you, Lori. We'll look forward to the 2020 report, and thank you for all of your insights in this area.
Sure.
So we'd like to wrap up by asking each of our panelists to give us their top piece of advice or their key takeaway for directors on oversight of SEC reporting and compliance. And Julie's going to share a screen. Lori, we'd like you to go and share your advice first, please.
Okay, so I think my advice, my biggest takeaway here is that it is your business to understand. As a board member, you need to understand what is going on at your company. You need to ask questions, and if you don't understand the answer, keep asking until you do. I often use this technique in testimony, and it can make for a long day, but I just keep asking and asking until I understand. I kind of take the position that if I'm not understanding, there's a reason I'm not understanding. And with this piece of advice, I do kind of think back to Ken Lay and Enron and some stories that came out of that scandal where, people said, I raised these questions, I asked these questions, I didn't understand the answer, I asked again, I asked a third time, I still didn't understand the answer from Ken Lay, but no one else was asking questions. So I just assumed that I wasn't getting it, everyone else understood, and that was that. And, I think that's a problem, right? So if you're not understanding, there's a real possibility that it's not limited just to you, and you just need to keep digging in until you feel like you do understand and you're comfortable with the position that the company is taking.
A little like the emperor's new clothes, right?
Exactly.
Okay, great. Terry Vaughn, please share your key advice for directors. Oh, Terry, you're on mute. Sorry. Julie, could you switch the slide to Terry Vaughn, please? There, thank you.
So my advice really just goes to trying to stay aware of what's happening in the company and what might be coming up. So keep your eyes open, be alert, listen to what you're hearing. And in this context, I think it's worth raising the value of periodic refreshment of the board. You can stay alert when you get some new sets of eyes. The board will, I think it's very healthy for the board to stay on top of the new issues that are coming up and look at things from a new perspectives.
Thank you. And Terry Pritchard.
So I think both Terry and Lori have great advice, and just following up on that, I would say my advice is do the right thing. If the board works to be sure that the company's management is honest and ethical, and if the board ensures that the company's culture is one of compliance with laws and policies, it's far less likely to have an SEC enforcement problem. And if it does have an SEC enforcement problem, it's far more likely to be able to defend itself because of a lack of intent to violate the law. So being motivated by doing the right thing, I think, is just really important.
Great, thank you, Terry. All right, so we do have a few questions that I'll read and we can discuss. So the first question is, what advice do we have on how to balance new issues for oversight, the types of things we've been discussing today, with those that have been traditionally on the board agenda? So things such as, the now overseeing COVID-19 issues. Terry Vaughn, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, that's tough. We just keep adding and adding and adding. I've seen a couple of my boards create new committees so they can offload some of the things that have been going on. The more standard kind of reporting that you have to get have it go through committees. But I do think that the full board, needs to make sure that they make room for the important things of the day. There have to be time set aside to think about the important issues, and then there has to be, and then you still have all this work that you need to do. So I'm not sure I have any brilliant suggestions for that. More conference calls.
More Zoom calls?
Yeah, more Zoom calls.
Any other thoughts from panelists on that question? That's really more of a director question. So.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
Okay, another question. Are there examples that we can share with regard to institutional investors raising, quote, red flags that may lead to an SEC investigation? In the Boeing example that we talked about earlier, those investors were questioning the delay in the board responding and the board pushing for information on development of the aircraft, but not pushing for information on safety. I think those types of areas are a focus for institutional investors.
Mm-hmm. I don't imagine that some of the red flags would be too different from what the SEC would be focused on. And some of the court cases that I when I went through the red flags, those were not just SEC enforcement actions. I canvassed private plaintiffs also when looking at that litigation. So that would have been included also. So I think the red flags are going to be, what was the company's response, how quickly, what was ignored or what was not significantly prodded.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, another question. There's a wide gulf between how public and private boards operate. We've talked about these best practices for public boards, but what would we recommend would be the most important for private boards? You know, in theory, private boards want the same rigor and oversight, but they also choose to stay private for a reason.
I'll take that one. I think that there's not that much difference in the private boards that I have served on. They want to have the same kind of controls in place. They want to know that they have the same confidence in the procedures. And so they will have, you know, the audit committee with all of the typical reporting that you would get, other than, you know, it may not be gap reporting in the case of a mutual insurance company, for example. And you don't have to talk about what are your quarterly SEC filings look like. And so those sorts of things go away, but the oversight, the tone at the top, for me, feels very similar. Yeah, so I don't think it's a huge difference, actually.
I agree. I've worked with nonprofit and non-public companies, and there is a strong push, even though you're not subject to the same scrutiny, that people generally want to follow the best practices that are set out for public companies.
Mm-hmm.
Any other thoughts? Okay, next question. Security risks are expanding, particularly with the current scale of work from home. What is expected of boards in the technology risk oversight area, and how is it changing?
The technology risk, that is one of the top, you know, prior to COVID, and even since COVID, because the risk of breaches and the attacks on computer systems since COVID has come into place, it just soared. And so cybersecurity has become a top agenda for one of the top agenda items for every board I'm on. And regular reports, I think somebody, Terry Pritchard, you might have mentioned this, someone mentioned getting regular reports from IT on what is the cybersecurity, what does it look like, what kind of attacks are we getting, have there been any breaches of personal information or, you know, protected information. That's important to get those kinds of to make sure that you're paying attention to that, and that you know that, and this is a tough one because I'm not an IT expert. And so how do you know that the individuals that are running the IT security operation are doing what they need to do? But that's an important question to answer.
Thank you, Terry. Any other thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I'll just add that the SEC did create a cyber unit a few years back. So this is really a focus for us. And, you know, I think cyber issues and the threat of hacking are something that is concerning for multiple reasons. But, you know, within our purview, there's always the threat of insider trading obtained from hackers that obtain, you know, that gain access and find out about companies' filings or other non-public material information in advance of filings, and then trade on that information. So that's one angle that the SEC comes at it from. And, you know, I think it is a very important issue and a moving target, you know, as the technology is just developing day by day. And as you mentioned, you know, we are all working from our home systems, which I am no IT expert either, but I imagine that does create another layer of risk. So, you know, I think this will be an important area continuing into the future for boards to focus on.
I find it really helpful for me to understand this, to have our IT people come in and do a deep dive on other hacking, other breaches, and sort of explain, this is what happened, and here is how our system would have responded. And so I think those kinds of things can give the board, they certainly give me, an appreciation for what the risk is. And so anyway.
Yeah, great points. Thank you. Okay, we have one other comment from one of our listeners. Strongly agree that there shouldn't be any difference between public versus private. Tone at the top is key. So,
There you go.
all right. Well, it looks like we are out of time. So let me turn things back over to Julie. And first of all, I want to really thank you very much, Lori, Terry Vaughn, and Terry Pritchard for participating today and for all your work preparing for this and sharing your insights. So thank you very much.